Hello, boys and girls. It is that time where it's time to watch a new episode of the reading of Monsters of Morley Manor. Today we're going to be reading chapters 13 and 14. So, last time that we stopped reading, the monsters and Anthony and Sarah decided to split up because they need to go do two different things. They need to try and go find the real Martin Morley, and they also need to go warn all the ghosts on Earth because the Flinduvians are going to try and use them as a power source to power a weapon. So they had to split up, and now we are with Gaspar, we are with Melisande, with Bob, with Anthony and Sarah, and we are back on Earth. And we have to go and try and find out what happened with the Land of the Dead, and we have to try and get there. And also we're hoping that Grandpa Walker is there, because that's the person that we're kind of looking for right now. Alright, so chapter 13, the original package. What? Cried Melisande and Gaspar together. What is it? Monday, I said, my voice weak. That's when they're going to tear down Morley Manor. They'll be starting in just a few hours. Oh, perfidious world, cried Gaspar indignantly, that a man's home should be subject to such whims and misfortune. Melisand's snakes began to writhe furiously. Bob crouched at her side, whining piteously. I told you they were going to do it, I pointed out. Of course, that had been more than 5 hours ago. A lot had happened to us since then, including being chased by horrible aliens, making a trip to another planet, and finding out that the very souls of Earth's dead were in danger. We must take quick action, said Gaspar. No time for thought, no chance for sweet contemplation. Such is the darkness of the world. He looked from side to side, almost as if hoping to find someone to help him. His shoulders slumped. We were on our own. All right, he said. Anthony, Sarah, please come back inside with us. We will need your help in returning to our human shapes. You want us to turn back? Cried Melisande in alarm. Here, on Earth? It was clear she didn't like the idea. Judging by the horrible hissing and fizzing they set up, her snakes liked it even less. We have no choice, said Gaspar. He sounded apologetic. You can turn back into humans whenever you want? I asked, startled by the idea. What is a human? Asked Gaspar, spreading his hands. Is it form or face that gives us sweet humanity, or is it something deeper and more real? Just answer the question, hissed Melisande impatiently. Gaspar sighed. Yes, we can turn back, but not easily. At least, it's not easy here. In fact, the process is quite painful, which is probably a metaphor, though I haven't figured out yet what for. Do you mind telling us how you got this way? Asked Sarah. Not at all, when we have time. At the moment, we've got work to do. What about Bob? I asked, gesturing towards the were-human cocker spaniel. There's nothing we can do about him right now, said Gaspar. His transformation was a different sort than ours. Now follow me. He led the way back upstairs to his laboratory. For a moment I was worried that the Flinduvians might have smashed it in a fit of spite, so I was relieved to see that it was still intact. The green jewel carved the heart of Zenterzana that provided power for the whole operation still rested in the control box. Even our yellow raincoats were right where we had left them. Now listen carefully, said Gaspar. I'm going to show you how to operate the equipment. But there is something else, something more important. This is not going to be pleasant for Melisande and me. We will plead for you to stop the process. You must not do this. No matter how we beg or scream, no matter what we say, you must not stop the transformation. To do so would be catastrophic. Is that clear? Clear, I said, feeling uneasy. Gaspar talked us through the order in which we had to push the buttons and pull the levers. He did it twice, then made me repeat it to him 2 more times. When he was satisfied, he took Melisande by the hand, and they went to stand beneath the same glass chambers we had used to enlarge them. Even after they were in place, I waited for Gaspar's nod before pulling the lever that would lower the tubes. As the chambers descended from the ceiling, Melisandre's snakes started thrashing wildly, tying themselves into knots. We heard a dull thunk of the glass against the platform. A moment later, Gaspar nodded again. Instantly, Sarah and I set to work, pulling levers and shifting dials. Soon a fantastic humming filled the room, getting gradually louder and louder. Sparks crackled through the glass chambers, which began to fill with green mist. Electricity, or maybe some other kind of power I didn't know about, skittered over the surface of the cylinders. All at once, Gaspar began to scream. "We've got to turn it off," cried Sarah in alarm. "No," I said fiercely. "He told us this would happen." Gaspar screamed again and began pounding on the side of the tube. Melisande uttered a high-pierced shriek that seemed to wind about his, spiraling upwards. I felt as if someone was scraping shards of glass down a blackboard. Melisande was on her knees now, and I could see her snakes through the green mist, thrashing, stretching out to new lengths as if they were trying to separate from her head. "Stop it," sobbed Sarah. "Stop it, Anthony. You have to stop it." "We can't," I said, though there was nothing in the world I wanted more at that moment than to do just that. If we stop now, Gaspar and Melisande might be caught halfway between human and monster forever. Gaspar screamed a third time. "For the love of God, Anthony, stop the process. I was wrong. Stop if you have any shred of mercy in your soul." He beat his head against the clear wall of the cylinder, sobbing piteously. "I can't stand it," cried Sarah. "Turn it off, Anthony." She lunged for the main lever, and I caught her just in time. She may be nicer than I am, but sometimes nice isn't the answer. I held on to her with all my might as she fought to get to the controls. It wasn't easy because I couldn't stand the screams either and wanted desperately for them to end. Even worse, I was secretly afraid that something really had gone wrong, that Gaspar and Melisande were being tortured, maybe even dying. But Gaspar had been deadly serious in his instructions. I must not stop the process once it had started. Sarah broke free of my grasp. I tackled her and we both fell to the floor. The screams of Gaspar and Melisande were louder and more desperate than ever. I felt as if I were being tortured myself. Was I doing the right thing? I was on the verge of letting Sarah go, of letting her pull the lever that would halt the horrible process, when I heard 3 loud snaps, just as Gaspar said we would. Instantly, the mist in the chambers turned purple. "There," I said, letting go of Sarah. "Now we can turn it off." Her face was streaked with tears. "I hate you," she sobbed. Ignoring her, I stood up and pulled the lever that raised the chambers. Coughing and choking, Gaspar and Melisande stepped out. Bob took one look at the two of them and began to howl. "Holy mackerel," cried Sarah, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "You guys look like movie stars." Turning toward me, she muttered, "Sorry about the fuss, Anthony." "Don't worry about it, kid," I replied softly. "When you're big like me, you'll know better." "You're a booger," she said. Probably would have said more, but it was too interested in Gaspar and Melisande. The human Gaspar had jet black hair, a strong, prominent nose, a high forehead, and wide-set brown eyes. He stretched and rubbed his arms, and shook his head like a dog that had just climbed out of the water. Melisande, still wearing her slinky dress, reached up to touch her own hair. She made a terrible face. "How boring," she muttered, as she ran her hands through a tangled mass of glossy raven curls. It was strange to hear her speak with no hissing. "So, now what do we do?" I asked. "First, Gaspar and I have to change our clothes," said Melisande decisively. I thought this was a terrible idea. Her dress looked spectacular, but she was right. She couldn't walk around owls' roofs in that way, attracting attention. Actually, she probably couldn't walk anywhere without attracting attention. "Melisande speaks the truth," said Gaspar. "Too often a man is judged on how he dresses. I must work fast this morning, and we will need every advantage I can get. Fond as I am of this lab coat, it has seen better days." "Changing your clothes is a good idea, but I don't think there's much chance of doing it," said Sarah. "Why not?" asked Melisande. "Well, aside from the fact that any clothes you would have would be 50-some years out of style, I doubt there are any here. Remember, they had a sale to clear the place out before the wreckers came. That's how Anthony got you to begin with." "Can you help us?" asked Gaspar desperately. "I might get to a lawyer immediately. They may be a vile species and the curse of humanity, but they're our only hope at the moment. Sarah glanced at me. Do you suppose they could wear Mom and Dad's clothes? I don't think Mom and Dad would be particularly pleased by the idea. On the other hand, we were in so far at this point I figured a little thing like loaning our parents' clothes to a couple of recently transformed monsters shouldn't slow us down. Hard to say. I think Gaspar is a little taller than Dad, and Melisande is more... I let the sentence drop. I don't know. It might work. Let's go, said Gaspar. What about Bob? Asked Sarah. Gaspar looked at Bob. The weird human began to whine. We'd better take him with us, said Gaspar. If anyone comes along, we'll just have to hide him. Do you think you can keep him quiet, Melisande? She looked at Bob, then shrugged. It won't be easy, but I think I can manage it. As it turned out, hiding Bob wasn't necessary. When we went outside in pale light that was creeping across the sky, Bob began to bark. Then he flopped onto his side and kicked, the way dogs do when they're dreaming. Then he rolled over and over. In a few moments he wriggled out of his clothes, a floppy-eared cocker spaniel, panting and wagging his tail. That's too weird, said Sarah, and Bob came trotting over to lick her hand. What a good dog, cried Melisande, patting Bob's head. Come on, said Gaspar, we have to hurry. Easy for him to say. He wasn't going to have to explain all this to his grandmother. We slipped into the house. Grandma was still asleep, though how long that would last I wasn't certain. Given her deafness, we weren't likely to wake her with our noise. On the other hand, she was an early riser. The one I was really worried about was Mr. Perkins. But when he came loping into the kitchen and bared his nasty little monkey fangs at us, Melisande said sharply, Oh, don't be silly. Settle down and be a nice boy. To my astonishment, Mr. Perkins did exactly that. He trotted docilely to her side, and when she reached down her arm, he climbed up and sat gently on her shoulder. Melisande has always had a way with animals, said Gaspar. I could hear a kind of pride in his voice at his younger sister's talent. I shook my head. We had seen a lot of bizarre things that night, but the sight of the fabulously beautiful Melisande in her skin-tight, slinky dress, with Mr. Perkins on her shoulder, running his paws delicately through her curly black hair, was as weird as any of them. Sarah yawned, which got me started too. I don't think I've ever been so tired in my life, I muttered. Please, said Gaspar urgently, just help us find something to wear, then you can sleep. Sarah led the way to her parents' bedroom, where Grandma was sleeping. Even though I didn't think she would hear us, we moved quietly. It took about half an hour and a few safety pins, but we finally got Gaspar and Melisande looking pretty acceptable. Dad's suit looked sort of doofy on Gaspar, but as Sarah said, he was so handsome he could get away with it. Melisande didn't look quite as wonderful as she had in her own dress, but that was probably just as well. Now what? Sarah asked. Now, Melisande and I go wake up some poor lawyer to try and save Morley Manor, said Gaspar. It's not going to be easy, but we should at least be able to stop the wreckers for a day. After all, we are the rightful heirs. In the meantime, you two get some rest. I want you fresh and ready for our trip to the land of the dead. Chapter 14. Past meets present. Despite the fact that I was exhausted, my mind was in such a whirl that I didn't know if I would be able to sleep or not. But the minute I hit the sheets, I fell into a sleep so deep it was like being dead. Good practice for what was to come, I suppose. I didn't wake up until noon. When I staggered out to the kitchen, I found Grandma standing at the corner, kneading some bread dough, and Mr. Perkins was sitting on his perch, eating an apple. He snarled at me when I came in. Obviously, Melisandre's influence had worn off. In fact, the whole scene looked so normal that I began to wonder if everything that I had thought had happened the night before had been just some sort of weird dream. Grandma didn't hear me come in, of course. I went and stood next to her so I wouldn't startle her when she realized I was there. She jumped a little anyways. Good morning, slug-a-bed, she said cheerfully. What did you two do last night? Sneak out and watch TV after I had gone to sleep? Something like that, I said, looking straight at her. This was the best way to talk to Grandma Walker. She uses the way your lips move to help figure out what you're saying. Is Sarah up? I added. She's in the bathroom. Why don't you pour yourself a bowl of cereal? That sounded like a good idea. I had been so tired when we got in that I had forgotten I was also starving. Mr. Perkins hissed at me as I went to the cupboard. The sound reminded me of Melisandre's snakes. I wondered how she and Gaspar were making out with their quest to find a lawyer to help them save Morley Manor. Before I could worry about it too much, I heard the doorbell. Grandma didn't hear it, of course, but when I stood up and started towards the door, she said, "I'll get it, Anthony. You eat." While she was gone, Sarah came back into the kitchen. I was about to ask her if last night had really happened when Grandma came back, too. She had an odd look on her face. Melisande and Gaspar were behind her, Bob trotting happily at their heels. "These people say they're friends of yours," said Grandma, looking a little puzzled. "It may seem strange to some of you that she would let them in, but you have to remember that in Owl's Roost, Nebraska, people still leave their doors unlocked at night. We are not what you would call the crime capital of the world." "How did you make out?" I asked, jumping to my feet. Gaspar smiled. "Justice has triumphed. We obtained a temporary restraining order to stop the demolition. Morley Manor still stands." "Gracious," said Grandma. "What do you two have to do with Morley Manor?" Then she narrowed her eyes. Her hands began to tremble. "Gaspar?" she whispered. He looked at her curiously. She clutched her heart. "Gaspar?" she said again, and this time her voice sounded accusing. Gaspar looked at her more intently. Suddenly his eyes grew wide. "Ethel?" he cried in astonishment. Grandma staggered and grabbed the back of a chair. Slowly she lowered herself into it. "Gaspar," she murmured. "Melisande. Bob." "What's going on here?" I asked, totally baffled. "That's what I want to know," said Grandma. She sounded terrified. Gaspar turned to me. "Your grandmother and I were once engaged to be married," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is you," whispered Grandma in awe. "But how is it possible? Where have you been?" "It's a long story," said Gaspar. "He's not kidding," I said. "Sit," said Grandma firmly. "Tell." We spent most of the afternoon at the kitchen table. There were 2 stories that needed to be told. What had happened to Sarah and me in the past 24 hours, and what had happened to Gaspar and the other Morleys over 50 years ago. Sarah, of course, also wanted to know all about Gaspar and Grandma having been engaged, but they seemed hesitant to talk about it, as if the topics were too painful to touch, and after a few questions, she gave up. I could tell it was upsetting them, she told me later. As for what happened to the Morleys, we don't actually know all of the story ourselves, confessed Gaspar, and won't unless the Wentar is able to bring back not only my brother, but the clone that had pretended to be him for all those years. But I can tell you how it began. He folded his hands on the table in front of him. I was, as you know, both a scientist and a magician. It was considered a great scandal by those who figured it out, put in Grandma Walker. Yes, and an even greater scandal when Big Brother here started going out with a woman so much younger than himself, said Melisande. Such is the way in the small town. It took me a moment to realize that the younger woman she was talking about was Grandma. Don't fool yourself, Melisande, said Grandma sharply. I've lived in the big city. People there gossip just as much as small town. More, probably. It is just you don't have to be known to get gossiped about by the right people. Go on, Gaspar. I'm eager to find out why you broke my heart. Breaking your heart was the last thing I ever intended, said Gaspar, reaching out to take her hand. Can we skip the romance and tell the story, I asked. I was still trying to get used to the idea of Grandma being younger than Gaspar, since she now looked 30 or 40 years older than him. But then she had kept on living for the 50 years that the Morleys had been frozen. Gaspar nodded, his face no longer that of a great lizard, but that of a lean, handsome man. I wondered if Grandpa Walker had known about this, which got me to wondering what it would have been like if things had worked out differently and Gaspar actually had been married to my grandmother. It was too weird to wrap my mind around. Our real trouble started when I discovered the secret of the starry doors, he said. I was angry, because I realized Martin had known for some time and had not shared it with me. Of course, that was still when we thought Martin was our real brother, said Melisande. Gaspar sighed. It changes so much to know the truth, and we haven't had time to think it all through, and that means... Anyway, since Martin had not told me what he was doing, I returned the favor and did not tell him what we were up to. But Ludmilla, Melisande, Albert, and Bob at my side, I began to explore other worlds. One planet in particular, Zenterzana, had a great fascination for us. In that place, people had learned to shape their own bodies as they wished, to change them as it suited their fancy. Since Melisande and Ludmilla had grown tired of all the attention they got for their great beauty, they quickly embraced the idea of taking on a strange image. "We tried several," said Melisande. "It was fun, like changing clothes in a dressing room, and not nearly as difficult to do as it is here," she added, turning to me and Sarah. Grandma shot her a glance, and I got the sense that they had not liked each other all those years ago. "Of course," said Gaspar, "Albert was always Albert, and Bob's wear problems had started back in Transylvania. They are who they are. It was Ludmilla, Melisande, and I who were playing at the shape-shifting. In late October of 1948, there was a town-wide Halloween party. The last night I ever saw you," muttered Grandma. Gaspar nodded. The three of us had decided to go in our altered shapes, which seemed like the best of all possible costumes. Alas, it was the night Martin discovered what we had been doing. A great argument broke out when we got home. Martin pulled out a strange weapon, something I had never seen before, and that's the last thing that I remember, until I found myself standing on the edge of your bathroom sink, looking up at Anthony and Sarah. Grandma squeezed his hand. "I cried for a long time after you disappeared," she whispered. Gaspar shook his handsome head. "I do not expect this, Ethel. My heart has gone into hiding, and I have no words for what I feel." I was startled to see tears in his eyes. Then I realized that even though 50 years had gone by for Grandma, for Gaspar it was as if he had seen her only the day before, seen her young and beautiful, seen her as the woman he was going to marry. And now she was old. "There was a great scandal," said Grandma softly. "People suspected that Martin had killed you all, but there were no bodies, so the police couldn't put together a case." She shook her head. "And all that time you were trapped in a box inside Morley Manor. Oh, that Martin, I could just—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, though I wasn't sure if it was because she couldn't bring herself to say something violent in front of me and Sarah, or because she couldn't think of something bad enough to do to Martin. "He wasn't the real Martin," said Gaspar softly, though whether any of us can ever know our true self is a great question anyway. "Those 50 years seemed like only a moment to us," added Melisande, "but the world has changed so. We were only out for a few hours this morning, but it was as if we had gone to another planet." He had not traveled before, been to Zenterzana and other strange places. I do not think I could have coped with all this. "And now you need to travel again," murmured Grandma, awe and wonder in her voice. "You need to go to the land of the dead to see my poor husband." Gaspar nodded. "Well," she said, "I'm going with you." Gaspar started to protest, but it was pointless. I knew that tone of voice. He had as much of a chance of talking Grandma out of going with us as we had of sprouting wings and flying. Though the way things have been going lately, I suppose even that wouldn't have surprised me. As for Grandma, she might have been astonished to see Gaspar, might even have felt the stirrings of an old love, but there was no way she was going to miss a chance to find or to visit Grandpa. Since Grandma could provide the needed connection for the trip, we had a long argument about whether or not Sarah and I should be allowed to come. Grandma thought it was too dangerous. We pointed out that what we had already been through, but that didn't convince her. Even Sarah's pleading, which is usually quite effective, did not change Grandma's mind. It was only when I argued that we would be in possibly more danger on our own than we would be if we went with them, that she relented. So at 11 o'clock that night, we returned to Morley Manor. "There's one thing I don't get," said Sarah as we approached the house. "If the key to making the trip is our connection to Grandpa, then why do we have to come back here to do it?" "2 reasons," said Gaspar. "First, the aura of the magic is stronger here. That was one of the reasons we bought the place to begin with, of course. And our work over the years did a great deal to increase that. Besides, we can go deeper into the earth here, which makes the journey easier." "So, the land of the dead is underground?" asked Sarah. Not really. From what the Wentar told me, I don't think you can say it is in this world at all. Even so, going underground brings you closer to a certain kind of truth. By the time we had reached the house, Melisande shuddered when she saw the bulldozer parked in front of it. The feathers of doom did indeed sweep close to our family home today, said Gaspar grimly. Once we were inside, he led the way down the cellar stairs. He held Sarah's flashlight in one hand, in the other a broomstick to knock down the cobwebs, which were so thick in some places they looked like a gray silk wall. On the far side of the basement was a door that led to another stairway, one that took us even deeper into the earth. A stray cobweb brushed across my forehead. The air was cold and damp, and Bob began to whine. "It's all right, boys," murmured Melisande, who was walking beside him. I counted 113 steps as we descended. "Where did these stairs come from?" asked Sarah. "Martin built them, of course," said Gaspar. "At one time we would have done it together." He sounded bitter and wistful. Finally, we reached the bottom. The chamber we entered was earthen-walled, but had a solid ceiling, supported by thick wooden beams. Gaspar instructed us to lie down and join hands. The dirt floor was cool and damp, but he said closeness to the earth was important. "Leave a space for me here," he said, talking to Grandma and me. We shifted apart, still holding hands for the time being. "Now, close your eyes," Gaspar said, turning off the flashlight. "Why should we close our eyes?" asked Melisande. "It's dark enough already." It will help you move deeper into yourselves," said Gaspar quietly. I closed my eyes and listened as he worked. He was muttering to himself, strange words that I couldn't make out. Every once in a while I heard him strike a match. I could see the flicker of light even through my closed lids. A pungent odor filled the room, a weird mingling of freshness and rot, sharp as vinegar, sweet as cider. My head began to whirl. "Now, think of those who have gone before," Gaspar said. A moment later I felt him separate my hand from Grandma's. He lay down between us, then took my hand in his. The soil was cool, damp, and firm beneath me. I felt almost as if I were laying in a grave. I turned my thoughts to Grandpa, thought of how much I wanted to see him, to tell him that I loved him. Suddenly, I looked down and saw a long silver cord. With a start, I realized that it stretched back to my own body. Grandma was floating next to me. Near her, I saw Sarah and Melisande. Gaspar was on the other side of me. Even Bob had made it through, looking as surprised as I ever seen a cocker spaniel look. Ahead of us, all around us, was a vast space filled with a kind of milky mist. Floating through it were the determined figures of some people, some of them sharply defined, others soft around the edges, so it was hard to make them out. Their moans and mutters filled the air. I looked down. All I saw was more mist. I had no idea how far above the ground we were, if there even was any ground for that matter, but I felt so light I had no fear of falling. "That way," said Grandma suddenly, her voice strong and firm. A murmur of astonishment rose from the shapes floating around us. We followed her. I wasn't sure how we were moving. We didn't flap our arms or anything. It was more like you just thought about where you wanted to go and then sort of moved in that direction. Ahead of us floated a spirit. Even from behind, he looked familiar. I felt a thickness in my throat, a lump of emotion I couldn't swallow away. "Hello, Horace," said Grandma softly. "We've come for a little visit." All right, well, that is chapters 13 and 14. I hope you enjoyed them, and I will be back for chapters 15 and 16 next time. Bye.